North Brother Island sits in the East River just off the Bronx. Once a small, isolated patch of land, it became home to Riverside Hospital and New York City's quarantine station from the late 19th century into the 20th, where people infected with contagious diseases were separated from the city. Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island treated cholera, smallpox, and yellow fever, and housed grim isolation wards that kept the sick away from Manhattan's teeming tenements. In an era of horse manure, overflowing gutters, and crowded immigrant lodging, public health officials faced recurring epidemics and a frightened city desperate for containment. The bacterium Salmonella typhi, which causes typhoid fever, moved silently through food and water, and by the first decade of the 1900s, investigators were hunting asymptomatic carriers. Mary Mallon, an Irish-born cook, 1869 to 1938, better known as Typhoid Mary, became the most infamous of those carriers. Sanitary engineer George Soper linked outbreaks to her cooking in 1906 to 1907. Mallon was seized and quarantined on North Brother Island in 1907, released in 1910, then legally confined again from 1915 until her death in 1938. Her case forced wrenching ethical and scientific debates about individual liberty, public safety, and the ugly realities of contagion, transforming Riverside Hospital into a grim theater of isolation and argument. The island's silence grew ominously permanent. In 1906 and 1907, sanitary engineer George Soper, hired by worried Manhattan families, traced a string of typhoid outbreaks to the kitchens where an Irish-born cook, Mary Mallon, worked. Soper published his findings and alerted the New York City Department of Health, documenting that Salmonella typhi had sickened households in Oyster Bay and across Manhattan, with case clusters following Mallon's employment. In March 1907, health inspectors, using his epidemiological mapping and bacteriological evidence, located Mallon at a Manhattan boarding house and removed her to Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island in the East River. Contemporary reports in the New York Times and medical journals recorded her seizure and the clinical tests that identified her as an asymptomatic carrier. Riverside was a clinical fortress, pavilion isolation wards with white-tiled walls, rows of iron cots, enamel basins stained yellow, disinfecting ovens clanking in the basement, separate staff kitchens, a morgue, and a seawall that turned the island into a kind of floating oubliette. Mallon was lodged in a small, sparse ward with a narrow cot and a metal washstand. The groan of steam sterilizers was never far away. Nurses in starched uniforms moved like sentinels, and her movement beyond the compound was barred. Subscribe. Maybe it would have kept her apron out of other people's kitchens. She denied having symptoms, refused to stop cooking, and fought the diagnosis in interviews and depositions. But the epidemiology was relentless. In 1910, officials released her on the condition that she never work as a cook again, a fragile reprieve that set the stage for a darker clash between individual liberty and public health. After her 1910 release, when she had signed a promise never to work as a cook, Mary Mallon slipped from surveillance into anonymity and returned to household kitchens and laundries under aliases like Mary Brown. She went back to preparing food for families and institutions despite the explicit terms of her release. By 1915, however, a brutal echo of earlier outbreaks made that choice impossible to ignore. In March 1915, officials traced a cluster of typhoid cases to Sloan Maternity Hospital and to several private homes where a cook matching Mallon's description had recently worked. New York City health investigators linked Salmonella typhi epidemiologically and moved to rearrest her. The city newspapers, which had already christened her Typhoid Mary, howled with indignation and fear, exposing gaps in public health law and the terrifying reality that an asymptomatic carrier could seed invisible epidemics. Meanwhile, North Brother Island's Riverside Hospital had hardened into a mechanized detention center. Nurses in starched uniforms followed rigid routines, daily inspection of wounds and sores, autoclave sterilizations, scrubbing enamel basins with carbolic acid, powdered beds turned and disinfected, and meticulous morgue logs for those who did not survive. The wards smelled of steam and antiseptic, tiles perpetually slick with disinfectant, iron cots clanking like a chapel of the damned. Institutional pressure mounted as physicians and city officials balanced containment against constitutional liberties. Public health authorities argued for indefinite quarantine when science could not predict who would infect the next household. Mallon's return to North Brother Island in 1915 crystallized that grim calculus. One human carrier forced a city to choose between liberty and the brutal arithmetic of contagion, setting the stage for the legal and moral showdown to come. In March 1915, when investigators linked a new cluster of Salmonella typhi infections to Sloan Maternity Hospital and several private homes, New York City health agents tracked down Mary Mallon. They rearrested her and marched her back to Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island. Bacteriological tests by the New York City Department of Health confirmed what George Soper had shown in 1907. Mallon was an asymptomatic carrier who could trigger invisible, lethal outbreaks. City physicians and legal advisors relied on public health statutes that allowed involuntary detention of people judged a continuing danger. Medical testimony emphasized that Mallon had broken her 1910 promise not to work as a cook, and that science could not predict when or if she might shed bacteria again. The outcome was indefinite quarantine, defended in departmental reports, the New York Times, and public health reports as a grim necessity where individual liberty yielded to collective safety. Archival records, Department of Health files, nurses' notes, and hospital maintenance ledgers show how Riverside hardened into a punitive medical machine. Sterilizers clanking like jail gates, iron cots creaking under cracked white tiles, boilers groaning, and plumbing leaking into dank corridors as the morgue ledger grew heavier with each epidemic season. Staff letters record routine antisepsis, relentless inspections, and the hollow loneliness of patients walled off from the city. Over time, the island wards decayed into an antiseptic ruin, paint flaking, pipes rusted, budgets starved, turning the logic of containment into institutional entropy. Mary Mallon remained confined on North Brother Island until she died of a stroke on November 11, 1938, still behind the seawall. Her fate marked a decisive moment when public safety trumped personal freedom and foreshadowed Riverside's mid-20th century decline and abandonment. Mary Mallon died of a stroke on November 11, 1938, still confined at Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island, her body isolated by a stubborn legal precedent and a surrounding seawall. The end was both anticlimactic and brutal. No public vindication, only a spare entry in the hospital ledger and a brief notice in the New York Times, while the island's wards kept their iron cots and enamel basins as mute witnesses. Her death closed the most notorious chapter in the hospital's quarantine mission, but it did not redeem the institution. Instead, it froze Riverside in a grotesque tableau. Budgets dwindled, staffing thinned, and the antiseptic clatter that once sounded like civic reassurance gave way to leaking pipes, mold-blackened tiles, and rusted autoclaves that no longer steamed. Corridors collected pigeon guano, and the morgue door sagged on swollen hinges. Hand-painted signs reading Riverside Hospital peeled like scabs from the brickwork. By mid-century, the island's role had collapsed. Medical practice had moved ashore, public health law had evolved, and North Brothers buildings fell into ruin, their decayed wards a visual indictment of policies that sacrificed human dignity to fear. Mary Mallon's case changed public health forever. Her quarantines in 1907 and 1915 at Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island showed that a person could carry Salmonella typhi without showing symptoms, and they pushed the legal system to accept involuntary detention as a way to stop contagion. The Typhoid Mary saga hardened quarantine laws, legitimized epidemiological surveillance, and left a legacy of stigma that fell hardest on immigrants and the poor, who were branded as public health threats. North Brothers' decaying wards and rusted autoclaves are a grotesque cultural memory, an architectural tomb that warns how fear can justify coercion. Those lessons echo in responses to SARS-CoV-2 and other modern outbreaks, where contact tracing, mandatory isolation, and digital surveillance clash with civil liberties. Preserving the ruins and confronting Mallon's story honestly requires balance. Effective public health without abandoning human dignity. History warns in blood and ledger.